France, winter of 1944. The sky was an iron lid, the ground frozen with fear and diesel. In a shattered village on the edge of the Ardennes, an entire American battalion was trapped. Their tanks burned out, engines seized, and ammunition running low. German artillery was closing in. The roads were mud and ruin, and the only thing standing between survival and annihilation was a man the soldiers called Mac, a grease-stained mechanic with a busted knee and a stubborn streak that could bend steel. When every officer said it was over, Mac looked at the wreck of a Sherman tank and whispered, "Not if I can make her breathe again." What he did next, with nothing but a tractor engine and sheer defiance, would turn desperation into legend and save hundreds of men from certain death. The 317th Armored Battalion had been moving for days without rest, mud up to their knees, engines choking in the cold, morale falling faster than the temperature. The Battle of the Bulge had torn through Belgium and France like a steel storm, and the men of the 317th were caught in its teeth. Their tanks, the proud Shermans that had carried them through Normandy, were now rusting hulks, shattered by artillery and bogged in frost. The Germans had cut supply lines. Fuel was gone and spare parts were a dream. The men huddled in the shell of a barn, the air thick with smoke and exhaustion. They could hear the distant rumble of panzers getting closer by the hour. Among them was Sergeant John Mac McAllister, a mechanic from Kansas. Before the war, he'd fixed tractors and trucks on his father's farm, hands always black with grease, mind always searching for ways to make broken things live again. The Army had drafted him as a maintenance man, not a fighter, not a hero, just the guy who kept the engines running. But now, with their commanding officer wounded and their vehicles dead, there was nothing left to maintain. Only survival. That night, as the men whispered about surrender, Mac walked through the wreckage, the burnt rubber, the twisted tracks, the lifeless bodies of machines that once roared like thunder. He stopped by the last tank that hadn't been completely destroyed. A Sherman, its turret jammed, its engine block cracked like bone. To most, it was junk. To Mac, it was hope wearing scars. He ran his hand across the cold steel and said to no one, "You've still got one more fight in you." He dragged what tools he had left, a wrench, a dented oil can, and his bag of scavenged parts. No replacement engine, no fuel, just mud, cold, and time running out. But in the barn behind him, he had spotted something. An old French tractor abandoned by villagers when the Germans came through. Its engine was small, clunky, meant for plowing fields, not driving into battle. Yet Mac saw something others didn't. The same heartbeat of combustion, the same rhythm of pistons and fuel. The same spark of life. When he told the others his plan, they laughed. A tractor engine in a Sherman? It sounded insane. Even the lieutenant, pale and half-conscious, managed a weak grin. "You're mad, Mac," he muttered. Mac just nodded. "Then it's a good thing madness is all we've got left." He worked through the night under artillery flashes that painted the sky red. Every explosion shook the earth, sending dust through the barn rafters, but he didn't stop. His breath came in clouds. His fingers bled through torn gloves. He tore out the dead engine piece by piece, listening to the echo of his father's voice. If it moves, it can be fixed. If it breathes, it can fight. By dawn, he had done the impossible, mounted the tractor engine into the Sherman's broken frame. It was ugly, crooked, and wrong in every way an engineer would hate. But Mac wasn't building for beauty. He was building for life. When he climbed inside the driver's hatch and turned the starter, the men held their breath. The engine coughed once. Then again. Then, with a deafening growl that cut through the cold, it roared to life. Not the proud roar of a war machine, but the rough, choking breath of a dying beast refusing to die. The men erupted in disbelief and cheers that echoed through the village ruins. For the first time in days, hope had a sound. But Mac wasn't done. One tank wasn't enough to save a battalion. What he didn't know yet, as smoke rose from the patched-up engine and the rumble of German armor grew nearer, was that his mad invention would soon become the only line between his men and oblivion. And the cost of keeping it running would nearly kill him. The dawn came like the slow lifting of a curtain on disaster. The light was gray, the kind that makes soldiers see ghosts in the fog. The German armor was closing in. They could hear it now, the deep mechanical pulse of enemy tanks grinding through frost and rubble. The Americans had no artillery, No reinforcements, no working radio. Only a single machine, a Sherman powered by the heart of a farm tractor, stood between them and destruction. Mac wiped the soot from his face, his eyes red from exhaustion. The tank rattled like an angry furnace, smoke pouring from its patched seams. Every vibration felt wrong, the kind that says something inside is about to give out. But it was moving, that was all that mattered. The men watched in disbelief as Mac steered the tank through the ruins, the improvised engine coughing and roaring like it was alive. He shouted over the noise, "If it runs, it fights." It became a battle cry that cut through the despair. The battalion's remaining soldiers rallied behind him, taking cover behind the resurrected Sherman as it rolled into position at the village edge. Mac wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't trained for combat, wasn't supposed to drive under fire. But when the first German shells hit, there was no time for ranks or titles. There was only instinct. He gunned the throttle and the tank lurched forward, clumsy but defiant, its armor screaming as shrapnel ricocheted off the hull. The enemy must have thought it was madness, a crippled tank charging head-on. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and burning oil. The tractor engine struggled under the weight of steel it was never meant to bear. The heat was suffocating. The smell of diesel burned the back of his throat. Every time Mac shifted gears, it felt like wrestling with fate itself. The transmission screamed, metal grinding metal, but he pushed harder. Behind him, the gunner loaded shell after shell, firing blind into the fog. Each blast shook the tank so hard it threatened to tear itself apart. Then a miracle, one of those strange turns of war where luck and courage collide. The tank's sudden movement drew German fire away from the infantry. It became a decoy, a noisy, smoking target that forced the enemy to focus their artillery on what they thought was a functioning tank battalion. In truth, it was just one machine, one mechanic's defiance disguised as power. Mac drove in circles using the broken walls as cover, the tractor engine roaring louder than any engine of its kind ever had. The Germans fired again and again, each explosion closer than the last. At one point, a shell hit the ground so close it flipped the tank half onto its side. The world went white and silence swallowed everything. When the dust cleared, the Sherman was still there, dented, scarred, but alive. And so was Mac. He climbed out, coughing, his face blackened with soot. The soldiers who had watched from the trenches stared at him like they were seeing something supernatural. He laughed once, a dry, cracked sound, and said, "She's a farm girl at heart. Just needed a little dirt to wake up." That moment changed everything. The battalion found their courage again. They regrouped, repaired weapons, and formed a defensive line. Using the smoke from the burning tank as cover, they launched a counterattack that stalled the German advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It was not strategy. It was not technology. It was survival, powered by one man's refusal to accept defeat. When the battle finally ended, the field was silent except for the ticking of cooling metal. The Sherman's engine had seized, its pistons melted from the strain. It would never move again, but it had done what no one thought possible. It had carried an entire battalion through the darkest hour. Later, when the war historians wrote about the Battle of the Ardennes, they mentioned logistics, weather, command failures. They didn't mention the mechanic. They didn't mention the tractor engine that refused to die. But the men who were there, the ones who lived because of it, never forgot. To them, that roar of mismatched metal and faith wasn't just the sound of a tank. It was the sound of survival, and Mac, he never called himself a hero. He just said, "Machines are like people. You push them too far, they break. But sometimes when it matters most, they surprise you." The storm did not end with silence, it ended with smoke. Thick, black, suffocating smoke that clung to the air like grief. The wrecked Sherman sat at the heart of it all, its sides scorched, its improvised engine ticking faintly, like a dying heartbeat refusing to quit. Mac sat slumped beside it, his hands trembling from exhaustion, oil dripping from his sleeves like blood. The battle was over, the enemy driven back, but inside him a different war had begun. He had pushed the machine and himself beyond every limit he knew. For 3 days he'd gone without sleep, without food, living only on adrenaline and sheer willpower. The other men called him a miracle worker, now a hero, but Mac didn't feel like one. He felt hollow. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes, the explosion that nearly flipped the tank, the gunner screaming orders, the rattling of bolts that could have snapped at any second. The engine he'd built out of madness had lived, but it had also taken something from him. Something he couldn't name. The battlefield around him looked like another planet. The snow was blackened with soot. The earth was littered with shards of metal and the twisted remains of what used to be machines and men. Somewhere in that ruin, his tank stood crooked, steam still hissing from its seams. He walked toward it, each step sinking into the mud. He laid his palm on the steel hull, still warm to the touch. "You did good, girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You did what none of us could." That night, the battalion regrouped in the ruins of the village. The surviving soldiers gathered around a small fire, their faces hollow but alive. They spoke in hushed voices about the day, about the tank that shouldn't have run, about the mechanic who refused to stop. One private said quietly, "That engine, it sounded like it was screaming for us." No one laughed. They all knew what he meant. It wasn't just a sound. It was defiance. Metal turned into willpower. But Mac couldn't rest. Even as the others slept, he kept his tools close. He tried to fix what couldn't be fixed. The melted pistons, the fractured frame. He worked not to repair the machine, but to keep the feeling alive. The feeling that something broken could still matter. His hands moved automatically even when his body begged for rest. In the stillness of the night, he caught himself whispering prayers to bolts and rivets as if they could hear him. By dawn, a medic found him half asleep against the hull, shivering under a torn blanket. His skin was pale, his breathing ragged. "You need rest, Sergeant," the medic said. "You've done enough." Mac opened his eyes and stared at the horizon where the sun rose through smoke and frost. "No," he murmured. "Not until every engine runs again." Word of his feat spread through nearby units. Officers came to see the so-called Frankenstein tank, a Sherman that had been brought back to life with a farmer's tractor heart. They photographed it, studied it, and shook their heads in disbelief. One British engineer reportedly said, "This shouldn't have worked." But it did. God help us, and it actually did. To them, it was an anomaly. To Mac, it was proof. Proof that desperation could birth miracles and that sometimes logic was the first casualty of survival. Yet beneath that pride burned guilt. He couldn't stop replaying the faces of those who didn't make it. The loader who never got out. The radio man who'd been hit before the tank even moved. The miracle hadn't saved everyone, and that haunted him. He'd done the impossible, but war has a cruel way of making even victory taste like ashes. Still, as he looked across the field of twisted wrecks, Mac saw something the others didn't. He saw machines as living things, and each one a story cut short, each one waiting for a stubborn pair of hands to bring it back. He realized then that his war wasn't just against the Germans. It was against the silence that followed destruction, against the belief that some things are too broken to be saved. He took one last look at the tank before they left the village. The snow had begun to fall again, covering the scars, softening the metal's edges. It looked almost peaceful. He reached out, touched the frozen steel, and whispered, "You weren't meant for war, but you fought it anyway. Maybe that's what we all are." As the convoy rolled out toward the next front, the ruined Sherman was left behind, but its story wasn't. The men carried it with them, like a ghost in their engines. A reminder that even in the darkest hours of war, courage sometimes comes dressed in grease and rust. By the time the 317th reached the next Allied line, the story had already outrun them. Soldiers spoke of a mad mechanic who resurrected a tank from the dead and turned the tide of a hopeless fight. Rumors grew with every retelling. Some said he'd built the whole engine from scrap. Others swore he'd driven the tank through fire with one arm shattered. The truth, as always in war, had already become legend. At headquarters, officers exchanged puzzled reports. One field message read, "Improvised Sherman engine functional. Civilian tractor motor installed. Mechanic, Sergeant John McAllister." The note was short, factual, almost cold. Yet between the lines was something that statistics could never capture. The heartbeat of invention born from desperation. Engineers and generals alike struggled to understand how it worked. "He made a farm tractor pull 40 tons of steel," one incredulous colonel muttered. "If that's not divine intervention, it's madness." When Mac arrived at the makeshift command post, his uniform was torn, his boots soaked, and his hands still stained black with oil. He looked nothing like the hero the rumors described. He didn't salute when he walked in. He just asked for more parts. The logistics officer blinked, unsure if he was joking. You want to build another one? Mac nodded. If it worked once, it'll work again. The officer sighed but said nothing. Because behind the front lines, something had changed. Mechanics began salvaging anything they could. Broken jeeps, civilian trucks, farm equipment left behind in villages. They copied Mac's madness, welding together whatever still moved. Tanks powered by generators, trucks patched with ship engines, jeeps running on spare aircraft fuel. It wasn't in any manual, but it spread faster than any official order. The soldiers called it the McAllister Method. Meanwhile, word reached the press. A few weeks later, an Allied war correspondent found Mac repairing a vehicle under a canvas tarp near Bastogne. The reporter asked what it felt like to save so many men. Mac didn't look up. He just said, "I didn't save anyone. The engine did. I just refused to let it die." It wasn't the answer the journalist wanted. No bravado, no slogans. Just truth, as raw and plain as the metal he worked with. His story ran in small military papers first, then made its way into Allied newsletters under the headline, "The Mad Mechanic of the Ardennes." Soldiers clipped the story, carrying it in their pockets like a charm. In foxholes, men whispered it to each other on long nights. "You hear about that guy who built a tank from a tractor? If he can do that, we can make it home." It became less about the machine itself and more about what it meant. That even in the cruel logic of war, human will could rewrite the rules. Yet Mac never sought the fame that found him. When officers offered to send him back for rest, he refused. "Engines don't rest," he said quietly, "and neither do the men driving them." He kept working through frost and fire, fixing what others abandoned. Every new tank he touched carried a small mark he scratched into the metal near the fuel intake. A single letter, M, not for his name, but for made to live. Even the Germans heard whispers of it. Prisoners spoke of the ghost tank, a Sherman with the growl of a farm machine that came roaring through the fog. To them it was a sign of madness but also of inevitability, that the Americans would fight with anything, even the dead. By spring, the Allies were advancing again. The tide of war was turning, but for those who had been there in that frozen village, victory would always sound like that mismatched roar, the cough and growl of a tractor engine fighting against a world that wanted it silent. And for Mac, it wasn't just about one battle. It was about what it proved, that courage isn't built in factories or forged in ranks. It's born in the quiet defiance of someone who refuses to give up, even when the world says it's over. He didn't write his name in history books, but in the roar of every repaired engine that carried soldiers home, his story lived on, an invisible signature carved in smoke and steel, reminding the world that sometimes the greatest machines of war are powered not by fuel, but by faith. The war did not let heroes rest. It never does. For Mac, the weeks that followed blurred into one long fever of smoke, noise, and exhaustion. He moved from one wrecked vehicle to the next like a doctor on a battlefield of dying steel. His body ached from frostbite and burns. His lungs rattled from the constant breath of fumes, but he refused to stop. The war had found its rhythm again, and somewhere in the chaos, so had he. A rhythm of repair, rebuild, repeat. Every night he told himself he'd stop after the next engine. But the next engine was always there, a lifeline for soldiers counting on him to make their machines live again. He'd learned to sleep in bursts, curled against the hulls of tanks still warm from battle. His hands were never clean anymore. They were burned black with oil that no soap could wash away. The officers called him a miracle worker, but the men called him something else, the machine whisperer. They swore he could hear engines the way a soldier hears artillery, by instinct, by feel. He could tell when a piston was misfiring from 50 yards away, could coax an engine back to life with nothing but wire and prayer. But what they didn't see, what no one saw, was how each miracle took something from him. Every spark of invention came with a cost. One night in February 1945, during a repair under fire, Mac's luck ran out. A mortar shell hit near the supply tent, spraying shrapnel through the air. He was thrown backward, his arm torn open, his shoulder shattered. The men rushed to help him, but he waved them off. "Get the engine running," he barked through gritted teeth. "We've got 30 minutes before they're on us." He tied a torn belt around his arm as a tourniquet and went back to work. Blood mixed with grease dripping into the snow, He didn't flinch. He just kept turning bolts. When the tank finally roared back to life, he collapsed beside it, his breath visible in the frozen air. The medic who found him said later that it didn't look like he'd passed out from pain. It looked like he'd given everything he had left to that engine. They sent him to a field hospital behind the lines, his left arm bound in plaster, his body fevered. For the first time in the war, he couldn't move, couldn't work, and that terrified him more than any shell or bullet ever had. Without machines to fix, he felt empty, useless. He lay awake through the nights, listening to the distant thunder of artillery, feeling like he'd been left behind by the very thing he'd dedicated his soul to. But the war, cruel as it was, had one last task for him. When word reached the mechanics' corps about Mac's condition, they began sending him sketches, broken designs, field improvisations, engine problems from the front. He couldn't hold a wrench, but he could still think. He dictated notes from his cot, redesigning fuel lines, inventing shortcuts for field repairs, finding ways to stretch dying engines a little longer. His hospital tent became an unofficial workshop, littered with pencils, diagrams, and pieces of scrap metal. It was there that his madness became method. The field improvisation manuals that spread through Allied engineering units, the ones that taught soldiers to rebuild engines using farm tools, bicycle chains, even stovepipes, all traced back to that freezing hospital tent and one man's refusal to stop helping. By the time his wounds healed, the war was ending. The German lines were collapsing. But the mechanic who'd saved a battalion had paid his price. His left arm would never move the same again. His hearing was half gone from years of explosions and engines. He could barely grip a wrench. Yet when asked if he regretted it, he only smiled faintly and said, "I was built for fixing things, even if it breaks me doing it." The Army offered him medals, promotions, recognition. He declined them all. He said the machines didn't care about medals. They only cared about being given another chance to run. And maybe, deep down, that's all he ever wanted too. Not glory, not memory. Just the chance to make something broken live again. When the war finally went quiet, and the engines stopped, Mac sat outside the repair tent for a long time, listening to the silence. It was a sound he'd almost forgotten existed, a sound that scared him more than artillery, because for the first time there was nothing left to fix. But even in that silence, he knew. The cost of genius isn't madness or pain. It's the willingness to give your soul to something that can't give it back. And somehow that was enough. When the guns finally stopped, the world did not erupt in celebration. It exhaled, slowly, uneasily. For men like Mac, silence was not peace, and it was absence. The war had ended, but its echo still lived in his bones. The sudden quiet felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The first night without distant artillery, Mac couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his cot, listening for engines that would never start again. The Army discharged him in the summer of 1945. They gave him a medal he didn't want, a handshake he barely felt, and a train ticket back to Kansas. He stepped off at a small rural station, duffel slung over his good shoulder, his left arm stiff and pale under the sling. The station looked smaller than he remembered, the air thicker, quieter. The war had stretched his sense of time until the world itself felt slower. Back home, the family farm was still there. Same red barn, same cracked windmill, same endless horizon. But his father was gone, and the fields had gone to weeds. He walked through the old workshop behind the house where rusted tractors sat beneath layers of dust. The smell of oil and hay hit him like a ghost from another life. He sat beside an engine block and ran his fingers over the metal, feeling the scars on his hand brush against the scars of the machine. It was the first time he'd touched an engine that didn't belong to war. Neighbors came to see him. Curious about the man who had rebuilt a tank from a tractor, they asked questions, half in awe, half in disbelief. Mac just shrugged and said, "It was just another engine, just bigger and meaner." But inside, he knew it was more than that. He could never explain the feeling of hearing steel breathe again in a place where death ruled the air. How could he? The world of peace had no language for that kind of defiance. He tried to work the land again, but the rhythm was gone. His left arm trembled, his hearing failed him in one ear, and every time he smelled smoke, his heart pounded as if artillery had returned. At night, he would wake up to phantom sounds, the distant rumble of an engine coughing to life, the echo of gears grinding under strain. He would sit up in bed, drenched in sweat, half expecting to find himself in a burning village again. But there was only silence and the lonely creak of the barn in the wind. Yet slowly life began to take root again. Children from nearby farms came to watch him work on old trucks, curious about the man who could fix anything. He never raised his voice, never boasted. He simply showed them how to listen to the hum of a motor, how to feel the pulse of a machine through the fingertips. "Engines talk," he'd tell them softly. "You just have to listen close enough." They didn't know they were learning more than mechanics. They were learning patience, respect, and the quiet kind of courage that doesn't need witnesses. Years passed. The war faded into books and parades, but for Mac, it lived in every sound of metal meeting metal. When he built his final machine, a small tractor from leftover parts, he painted it the same dull green as a Sherman tank. He never said why. Maybe it was a tribute. Maybe it was a reminder. One afternoon, a young reporter came to interview him for a local paper. The story of the mad mechanic had become one of those strange wartime legends, half myth, half truth. The reporter asked if it was real. Did he really save an entire battalion with a tractor engine? Mac paused, his eyes distant, his hands resting on the hood of his machine. He smiled faintly. "You don't save people with engines," he said. "You save them with belief. The engine just gives that belief a sound." The reporter didn't understand it then. But those words, quiet, unpolished, sincere, captured everything about him. Because for Mac, the miracle was never the machine. It was what it meant. That even in the coldest, darkest moments of human history, one man's stubborn hope could become louder than fear itself. When he died in his sleep years later, they found him in the barn, slumped against the same old tractor, a wrench still in his hand. The machine was running, gently, steadily, like it was keeping him company on his way out. And when the neighbors came to see him off, they swore they could still hear that low, rhythmic hum, the same sound that once roared across the Ardennes. The sound of a man's spirit refusing to be silenced. History has a strange way of burying the people who shaped it. The battles are remembered, the generals are immortalized, but the ones who held the wrenches and who kept the war moving fade quietly into the margins. For years after the war, Mac's story lived only in the whispers of veterans' reunions and the fading ink of archived field reports. But history, like steel, doesn't stay buried forever. It bends, it rusts, and eventually something brings it back to the surface. In the early 1950s, as the Cold War shadow spread across the globe, a new generation of military engineers began studying the chaos-born innovations of World War II. The battlefield improvisations, the patched tanks, the welded trucks, the impossible engines, were no longer seen as desperate acts of survival. They were blueprints for adaptability. Military analysts combed through forgotten reports, and there, buried in the archives of the Ardennes campaign, they found a peculiar note. Improvised engine installation, successful field operation, mechanic Sergeant J. McAllister. It caught the attention of a young British researcher named Alan Hartley, who was compiling data on unorthodox field engineering. He became obsessed with the McAllister case, calling it proof that chaos can breed creation. He traced every scrap of evidence, testimonies, repair manuals, even the surviving photographs of the damaged Sherman. When he finally pieced the puzzle together, he realized something extraordinary. The same principle that drove Mac's insane repair, adaptability through hybridization, was now shaping the next generation of armored vehicles. In post-war labs across Europe and America, engineers began experimenting with modular engine designs, inspired by field improvisations like Mac's. Tanks that could swap power plants, aircraft that could use backup systems from ground machinery, vehicles built not for perfection but for resilience. It was no coincidence that by the late 1950s, NATO forces adopted flexible maintenance doctrines that mirrored what Mac had done instinctively under fire. Make it work with what you have. Mac never knew any of this. He died before his story reached those who turned his madness into science, but his influence lingered in ways he could never have imagined. During the Korean War, U.S. mechanics referred to the practice of salvaging parts from civilian machinery as Mac jobs. Decades later, during the Vietnam conflict, soldiers revived the phrase, "do it the Mac way," meaning to improvise when logistics failed. It became folklore, woven into the DNA of military engineering even as the man behind it was long forgotten. And it didn't stop with war. Civil engineers who studied disaster recovery in the 1970s found parallels between Mac's approach and early emergency response methods, using farm tools, generator engines, and improvised systems to restore power and mobility in the aftermath of chaos. The philosophy was simple but profound: function over form, survival over perfection. It was the gospel of the field mechanic, refined by blood and mud echoing through every generation that learned how to fix instead of surrender. Some historians still debate whether Mac's story was real or whether a single tractor engine could truly carry the weight of a Sherman tank through battle. They argue over details, dates, tonnage, and torque. But those who study human ingenuity know that the math doesn't matter as much as the meaning, because war at its heart isn't about numbers, it's about will. And sometimes the impossible happens not because it can, but because someone refuses to believe it can't. In the archives of Fort Knox's Ordnance Museum, there's a faded black and white photograph labeled simply Field Repair, Ardennes, 1944. It shows a mechanic half hidden by smoke, bent over a tank engine, snow falling all around him. The caption doesn't name him, but if you look closely, there's a wrench in his hand and a faint smile on his face. You can almost hear the echo, the low hum of iron and will, whispering across the decades. That was Mac's legacy, not a name carved into history books, but a sound carried forward, the sound of steel defying silence. Time is cruel to paper. It yellows, it cracks, it fades under dust and memory. But sometimes a single scrap survives long enough to remind the world of what it almost forgot. In 1987, more than 4 decades after the Battle of the Ardennes, a retired French farmer clearing his barn near Bastogne stumbled upon an old metal toolbox buried behind rotted beams. Inside were rusted wrenches, a dented lighter, and a leather-bound notebook stamped with the faint initials JM. The pages were filled with sketches, crude, hand-drawn diagrams of tank engines, gear assemblies, and piston mounts. But what caught the farmer's attention were the notes scrawled in the margins. They weren't just mechanical calculations. They were thoughts, raw, human reflections written in a mechanic's shorthand. Make it live again. Weight is not the enemy, friction is. Faith is the fuel when there's nothing left. The farmer didn't know what he had found. He passed it to a local museum in Bastogne, where it sat unnoticed for years until a young historian named Elise Bernard came across it while cataloging artifacts. She began comparing the sketches to military repair archives, and the pieces fit perfectly. Every diagram matched a specific Sherman variant used by the 317th Battalion. The handwriting matched the signature on a single field report, Sergeant John McAllister. The discovery stunned historians. For decades, Mac's story had been treated as rumor, a myth soldiers told to romanticize survival. But this notebook changed everything. It proved that behind the legend was method, precise, deliberate, even visionary. Elise published her findings in a 1991 paper titled The Mechanic Who Outsmarted War. It drew global attention. Military engineers, veterans, and historians alike began re-examining how improvisation shaped the outcome of the war. In her interviews, Elise described what moved her most wasn't the technical brilliance, it was the humanity between the lines. He didn't just write about engines, she said. He wrote about people. Every note about torque or pressure is paired with a thought about courage or fear. He wasn't just repairing machines, he was reminding himself that they, like men, could survive under pressure. Soon, exhibitions followed. The notebook was displayed behind glass, open to a page showing a cross-section of a hybrid engine labeled Field Version, Lives If It Must. Visitors stopped and stared, whispering to each other, as if the faint pencil marks themselves carried the sound of his faith. Veterans who had fought in the Ardennes visited in silence, some with tears in their eyes. They had lived that madness, breathed that smoke, and here, finally, was proof that the man who saved them was real. The rediscovery of the notebook sparked new questions about the forgotten genius of wartime engineers, the ordinary men who fought not with rifles, but with imagination. Scholars began to see the Second World War not just as a conflict of armies, but as a war of invention. The heroes were not only the ones who stormed beaches, but also those who built bridges, patched tanks, and turned broken engines into salvation. When asked what she thought of him, Elise said something simple. He never wanted to be remembered. But history remembered him anyway, so because he built something that couldn't die. That notebook, dye-stained, cracked, and fragile, became the soundless voice of every soldier who ever looked at ruin and saw potential instead of defeat. It wasn't just Mac's blueprint. It was a map of human defiance, and in the faint pencil marks, you could still trace the tremor of his hands, the same hands that once rebuilt a tank in the heart of war and, in doing so, rebuilt hope itself. In the decades that followed, the world grew louder with machines, faster with progress, and quieter in gratitude. Jet engines replaced propellers, computers replaced maps, and men like Mac, men who worked by touch and instinct, became ghosts in the age of precision. Yet somewhere in that rising hum of modern power, echoes of his philosophy lived on, because what Mac had truly built was not just a tank that ran, it was an idea. A belief that machines could feel, if the hands that built them cared enough to listen. Engineers began to quote him without knowing his name. Manuals spoke of intuitive mechanics and field empathy and adaptive design. The spirit of his madness, that fierce refusal to surrender when logic demanded retreat, became the backbone of innovation. The first astronauts who trained for the Apollo missions carried that same creed. If it breaks, fix it. If it can't be fixed, make it live another way. That was Mac's inheritance to the future, a legacy of perseverance written not in medals, but in motion. When Elise Bernard's book, The Mechanic Who Outsmarted War, was finally published in the early 2000s, it revived his name like a spark in dry kindling. Readers around the world were stunned by the simplicity of his courage. No grand strategy, no secret weapon. Just one man, a set of tools, and the will to defy the impossible. Engineers began to see themselves in him. Veterans found peace in his story. Teachers told it in classrooms to remind students that genius doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears overalls and carries a wrench. And yet, the deeper truth of his story wasn't mechanical at all. It was human. Mac's genius was never about engines, it was about empathy. He understood that machines, like people, responded to care. They broke when ignored. They came alive when believed in. His madness wasn't defiance of rules. It was faith that even the most broken things could still matter. That same faith now powers the world's greatest inventions, from prosthetic limbs to space rovers, each one a continuation of that stubborn belief that there's always one more spark left inside the impossible. At the Battalion Museum, the old notebook still rests beneath glass. Visitors lean close, tracing the faded handwriting with their eyes. On the final page, written in shaky lines, are 5 words that survived time and translation. If it breathes, it lives. No military term, no engineer's code, just the creed of a man who made the dead breathe again. In the quiet of that room, surrounded by artifacts of war and memory, the air feels almost alive, as if the walls themselves remember the hum of the tractor engine that once saved hundreds of men from certain death. It's a reminder that history isn't made only by those who destroy, but by those who repair. That courage is not always found in charging forward, but in staying behind to make sure something, anything, still runs. Mac never lived to see himself called a hero. But maybe that was the point. Heroes don't need to be remembered. Their work remembers them. Every time a mechanic refuses to give up on a broken machine, every time an engineer builds something new from something old, every time a soldier finds hope in the wreckage, that's where he lives. Because long after the guns go silent, long after the smoke clears and the world forgets the names of the battles, the sound of one engine still echoes through history, rough, imperfect, miraculous. The sound of belief turning death into motion. The sound of a man who made machines breathe. Time has a way of polishing memory, turning sweat into legend and pain into poetry. But beneath the shine, the truth of John Mac McAllister's story remains raw and human. He was not born for greatness. He did not lead battalions or write history with strategy. He wrote it with grease-stained hands, sleepless eyes, and a will that refused to die. His battlefield was not made of maps and commands. It was a broken tank, a dying engine, and a moment when giving up would have been easier than believing. That belief, that wild, reckless faith became his true invention. It was the power to look at something shattered and see not ruin but potential, To hear silence and imagine sound. To see death and whisper, not yet. That is what made him extraordinary. Not the miracle of a tractor engine pulling a Sherman into battle, but the miracle of a man who saw life where the world saw only endings. In every age since, his lesson has echoed quietly in those who build, repair, and dream. When a firefighter cuts through wreckage to save one more life. When an engineer refuses to abandon a project everyone calls impossible. When an old farmer brings a dead machine back to life just to see it run again. That spark, that defiance, is the same force that drove Mac into the snow of the Ardennes with nothing but tools, courage, and madness. He proved that genius isn't found in perfection, but in persistence. That courage isn't loud and it's steady. It's the whisper that says, "I'll try again," when the world has already turned away. And in a war built on destruction, he reminded us that the greatest weapon of all might be creation, the quiet act of rebuilding in the face of despair. Today, the engines he once fixed are relics. They're steel cold, their sounds long faded, but the idea he left behind still runs. In the machines that carry humanity forward, in the hands that refuse to stop working, in the stubborn hearts that keep believing. Because in every era, the world needs someone willing to do what Mac did, to kneel beside the broken, to light a spark, and to say, "Breathe." That is the lesson that lived. That even when hope is rusted and buried, it can still roar back to life. All it takes is one person, one mad mechanic, to remind us that nothing and no one is ever truly beyond repair. And as long as that truth survives, as long as somewhere, someone still believes in fixing what's broken, the sound of Mac's engine will never fade. It will live on eternal and defiant in every heartbeat that chooses to keep going when the world falls silent.